The Attorney General could review the sentencing of the man who killed 3 people in Nottingham last June after receiving a submission that it was unduly lenient.
Yeah, Valdo Calocane is expected to spend the rest of his life in a high-security hospital. He was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia at the time and has been sentenced for manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility. The victim's families say true justice has not been served.
Joining us now is forensic psychologist Dr. Soham Das. A lot of anger from the families yesterday. This just adding to their already immeasurable pain. They believe that Valdo Calocane should have been in prison. Why isn't he?
Good morning to both of you. Look, I absolutely sympathise with the family, and you can't put into words the horrific experience that they're going through. But if we're looking at it technically, I am very confident that diminished responsibility was the correct call, because we know that Calocane was psychotic. This is not something that he tried to chance the system at the last minute. He has this long history of mental illness. Years before the events, there was some very bizarre behaviour, as I'm sure your viewers would have known. He went to MI5. He believed he was being controlled. He was hearing voices, and these things crucially affected his behavior. So according to the psychiatric reports, he was acting on voices and acting on the belief that if he didn't carry out these killings, these stabbings, that something bad would happen to him and his family. So I think that he does meet the medico-legal criteria for diminished responsibility.
He would have been assessed by many psychiatrists as well to come up with this diagnosis. You talk and in great detail there about the delusions he was suffering. I mean, clearly it's a medical diagnosis where he has delusions, these false beliefs, hallucinations. He believes he's being controlled. Also, just talk us through insight, because do you think he had insight into what he was doing?
No. So, I don't think he has insight into his actual mental illness. And the reason that I say that is because he had reported this during the assessments, number one. Number two, he was repeatedly admitted to psychiatric hospital in the years leading up to it. And he had a pattern of stopping his medication, which suggests that he didn't think that he needed it. As to the question of whether he had insight into what he was doing, now I think this is quite a complicated issue, and I think there's a bit of a grey area. So I believe that he knew what he was doing, as in he knew he was physically hurting and killing people, and that it was illegal and that he would go to prison. So he knew what he was doing and he knew it was wrong, which means that he wouldn't have got the insanity plea, which would have completely given him acquittal. But despite that, I also think that he was substantially impaired in his ability to understand what he was doing, form a rational judgment, or exercise self-control. And those are the 3 limbs of diminished responsibility. So just to clarify, as the name suggests, diminished responsibility means that his level of responsibility is lessened. So instead of murder, it's manslaughter.
For the families, it is devastating, that verdict of manslaughter, and the fact that he's been given a hospital order rather than a prison order. He was previously sectioned 4 times, and after each of those incidents, the pattern of behaviour would start again. There were many warnings, weren't there? There was an assault on an emergency worker. There was one case where a woman jumped out of a window. She was so frightened of him. And yet, he was still allowed to live within the community. And the NHS in Nottinghamshire saying, well, that's the aim, to try and support people in the least restrictive way. But it's pretty frightening, isn't it, for us reading it, and when you see the grief of those families, to think that one individual for whom there were many warnings was able to cause such devastation.
So I think there's a few different factors that are going on here. Even though he did get admitted several times into hospital, I'm assuming that he was relatively well at the point of discharge. I can't say that for a fact because I've not read the medical reports because they're not available, but he wouldn't have been discharged had he not been relatively well. I think the problem is that Calocane continually stopped taking his medication. So he was going through this cycle, as you're saying, of becoming worse and relapsing and then going into hospital. The other thing that I would say is I agree there were some warning signs. There was some violence, particularly in the latter admissions, but there wasn't in the first few admissions. And I think that he didn't telegraph his intentions. He hadn't told previous staff members of his delusions about killing people. So even though they were very slight red flags, it was also I think that level of violence was also unpredictable compared to, for example, somebody with a psychotic disorder who had frequently lashed out with violence on a long-term basis, in which case it would have been more likely for this kind of escalation.
Can I just ask you a couple of things? Firstly, in terms of infrastructure, when I trained, we had many more secure psychiatric facilities. They have diminished. I think we only have 7,000 psychiatric beds now. That's the first thing. And just in terms of the medication, when we discharge people into the community, we're hoping they take their drugs. Now, clearly, that is a terrible system. Is there no way they can have long-term depot injections, something where medical professionals are in charge of the medication these patients are on to make sure they are safe in the community?
Yeah, that's a very reasonable question. I suppose it's a balance, isn't it? Because you have cases like this where clearly what he did was absolutely horrific, but for every one Calocane, you have hundreds of, if not thousands of psychiatric patients who are not a danger to themselves. And if they're enforced medication, and as I'm sure you'll know, this medication, especially antipsychotics, can have quite nasty side effects, from weight gain to dribbling to making the individuals very sedated. There are downsides of this medication, so it's a balance of how much we can force them. But as you say, David, there are depot medications, so there are injections that the patient can be physically given by a nurse, and they're long lasting, so they can last, depends on the medication, it could be a week, 2 weeks, or a month, which means that the struggle of getting the chemical into the bloodstream for these individuals is much less. So that could have been a realistic possibility. I agree with that.
We're going to be discussing this later on in the programme as well, because this story is across many of the front pages of the newspapers this morning. Dr. Duss, thank you very much indeed for joining us with your expertise.